Hi guys, and welcome to Sew Shop Create. So today we're going to be doing this 3D bat coffin. So the coffin itself is releasing with Dimensional Drinks next week. The bat wings we're going to sculpt. Now I free-handed the bat wings, okay? Like I rolled out my clay, I drew them on the clay and cut them out with an X-Acto knife. I wanted to give you guys something that could possibly help you. So on my drawing app, I drew a left wing and a bat wing, and I put an instructional sheet with it. If you have Procreate or anything, I would personally just import that to whatever you use to print, size it with the dimensions I gave you, cut them out on a piece of copy paper, print them out on a piece of copy paper, and just cut out each wing and trace that onto your clay. So it is really easy to just kind of freehand it, but I wanted to give you guys some kind of tool to work with if that wasn't an option for you. So I hope it works for you. It's just a PNG of a left and right bat wing, and then included in that is going to be this PNG file for free. It is not in SVG format because I don't work with SVGs, but I was able to just save this PNG and send it to my Cricut machine to cut. So make sure you grab those items below for free, and we're gonna get started. Alright, hi guys, so this is our coffin sleeve from Dimensional Drinks. I personally am using the Mother Tumbler 20 ounce skinny, but if you buy their bundle, it'll come with a tumbler that fits that perfectly. So let's start by taking our black Sculpey clay and working it in our hands until it is nice and soft and easy to work with. This process took me probably like 4 minutes because I wanted it to be really nice and soft and smooth. And then I'm going to take my acrylic roller and I'm going to roll them flat. I did about 1/3 of an inch thickness for both of my clay pieces. It's not perfect. I don't have like the fancy machines that flattens it, so I just kind of eyeballed it and tried to make them both the same thickness. And I'm rolling those nice and smooth. And now we're going to draw our bat wing. I am freehanding this, but I did upload a PNG for free in the description below if you wanted to kind of print that out and trace it. But it was pretty easy to just kind of draw this on my clay with my X-Acto knife. I draw bats on my iPad all the time, so I kind of already knew the shape that I wanted. So after I sketch that out, I'm now going to use my X-Acto knife and put a lot more pressure so it cuts through our clay piece. I will say I'm not worried about super rounded, clean edges because I'm going to be glittering these wings. So we do want to smooth it out. We want to make it as perfect as possible. But at the end of the day, all that glitter and epoxy is going to cover it up. So it wasn't like a huge deal. Look how cute. I'm just kind of shaping that in my finger, making sure that it fits my coffin how I want it to. And after I like my shape, I'm going to use that same wing and trace it on my second piece of clay. That way both wings are even and identical for both parts of our coffin. Awkward silence. I know you guys love my awkward silence, so once again, tracing it as good as possible. I didn't speed this part up. I know clay can be a little scary, so this is all in like real time so that you guys can learn as much as you can. After we have both wings, we need to clean up some edges, obviously. There's a few parts that needed trimmed and smoothed out. I like to smooth out the edges with my hand and rubbing alcohol. Rubbing alcohol is key. So here's rubbing alcohol on my finger, and I'm just using that to kind of flatten it, make sure it's all even, and taking my fingers to curve those edges as best that I can. After you're happy with both wings, you're going to put them on a baking sheet, nice and flat on a piece of parchment paper, and you're going to want to follow the instructions on your Sculpey packaging. If you're using a different version of Sculpey than me, you might have different instructions, so just take a second to read the instructions and put them in the oven, and it'll be fine. After they're out of the oven, you're going to let them cool and set them aside. All right, guys, we need to fill the gaps of our tumbler and the tumbler sleeves because I'm using a different tumbler than what came with it. So I'm using Epoxy Sculpt for this. I definitely recommend this method for sealing the cracks. I've done a few of these tumblers and I didn't seal the cracks and I instantly regretted it. So work that in your hands until it is mixed thoroughly. I don't know how long it took to dry. You'll have to read the instructions, but I believe I just let it sit for like an hour or two and it was good to go. So let's take the lid off. Now let's start by filling in the top cracks. So this took a little bit of planning. So I'm actually going to move that tumbler out of the way here in a second. And I'm going to roll this on my marble board and I'm going to roll it pretty flat. And this allowed me, it was just easier to work with. And I was able to take my X-Acto knife, cut little strips. And this is what I did. I rolled really thin little noodles and I put that between my tumbler and my sleeve to fill the gap. Now, I'm not worried about this being perfectly smooth because I'm going to have a drip cover the whole rim anyways. So if you want it to be really smooth, you're going to want to take a little extra time to smooth that out with your finger. But this, I'm so glad I had this stuff on hand because I couldn't use oven bake clay because I can't bake the tumbler sleeve. And I also didn't have to epoxy my sleeve to my tumbler because once this epoxy sculpt dries, it's going to be good to go. So I tried to smooth that out as best possible and cover all the gaps, but I wasn't super worried if it looked a little sloppy. Now I'm going to do the same thing to the bottom. I'm filling in those cracks. I am trying to get this a little smoother, but I know that after a few coats of epoxy, I'll be able to sand it down until it's smooth anyways. And then you're just going to let that dry. Just read the instructions on your packaging. Now that our bat wings are out of the oven and they're cold, I'm using UV resin to apply this. If I had that 5-minute epoxy stuff, I think that would have been the best route, but I didn't have any. And I didn't think that just liquid fusion would be strong enough to hold these in place. And I didn't want to use epoxy because I was trying to speed the process. So it took about 5 minutes to cure this, but after it was cured, it was on there pretty good. But I will say be very careful handling this until you epoxy the whole thing. Those wings are still fragile and it wouldn't take much to break it off. After my wings are on, I'm airbrushing my sleeve with my airbrush machine. If you're going to use spray paint, you would have wanted to spray paint your tumbler before you put your clay on because you shouldn't apply spray paint to clay, but airbrush paint is okay. If you have any questions about that, let me know. So now I'm going to start glittering my bat coffin. I'm working in sections. I'm using Adhesive Apothecary Cauldron colors. They did not release yet, but you could also just use their normal glitter glue. It just won't be pigmented black. But I know that their stuff dries pretty fast, so I'm working in sections. I didn't want to glitter glue the whole thing and then parts dry before I was ready to glitter it. So I'm doing one wing at a time. I made my own mix from PDB. I use Midnight and I can never pronounce it, so I'm just going to put it below because if I mispronounce it, Crystal will laugh at me and call me fake spooky. But the reason I did that is because I wanted to use more of a fine glitter, so this wasn't a pain in the butt to sand, but I also really wanted those rainbow hues from the glitter that I will not mention. It's Ouija. I can't pronounce it. I don't know why I am, but I can't. So here I am doing the front of the coffin. Same process the whole way around. You could use epoxy as well. If you applied a really thin coat of epoxy to your entire thing, you could glitter it that way. But I really love Adhesive Apothecary, and that is my go-to method for glittering. Now you're going to get a little bit of that awkward silence because I don't know how to put music in the background, and you guys probably don't want to hear me talk about literally nothing to make the time go by. Oh yeah, there we go. I sped this part up for you. Yeah. All right, almost done. Then we're going to get the bottom. All right, now I can talk. After you finish, you're going to let that dry for about an hour or two. And then I spray in my whole tumbler with a clear glue, just so when I go to epoxy, I don't have glitter moving around. So Loctite, Elmer's clear glue spray, clear spray paint also works, just to save our butts later. So guys, we are about to epoxy our bat. Let's get started. All right guys, now I'm taking CC DIY medium viscosity. I like this epoxy because it's really thin, and I knew I needed thin epoxy for this giant tumbler. So I'm doing equal parts of part A and part B, and I am mixing that thoroughly. And I'm actually going to show you how I apply my first coat of epoxy, but I'm not going to show you the other ones because you'll kind of get the point. I'm using Dino's Tumbler Turner's Ruler Rotator because it is nice and big and it holds up these 3D pieces so well. So I'm just putting a thin coat over the whole tumbler. This is black glitter. It'll collect bubbles easy, so I know that thick coats are not going to be my friend. So I'm just making sure that I get it as smooth as possible. And I did this process twice. So this is my first coat. I let it dry and cure, and then I put another thin coat of epoxy right over it. Make sure you get the wings good, the bottom, even the rim. The nice thing about this tumbler is you can just kind of turn it off if you need to focus on one area. So I turned it off whenever it was time to do the wings, and it just kind of made it a little easier to make sure I was getting a thin, even coat on the whole thing. Make sure you also torch your bubbles about 20 minutes after your application. And I'll say this now, I would not use facet epoxy on this tumbler besides the drip, because if you use a facet epoxy, depending on your temperature and your conditions, it might cure before it's fully able to self-level, and I have made that mistake on 3D tumblers, so I recommend not using it. Alright, now that we have 2 coats on here, I'm going to give it a really good sand. Black glitter is not my friend, and it always gives me problems, so I am making sure that I'm sanding really well. I'm using my little sander for the edges and the rims and the wings, and at one point I did take my big electric sander and I only used that on the big flat parts of my coffin because that made it smooth in like under a minute. And I will say, now that this has epoxy on it, it's not really that fragile anymore. I could pick this whole thing up with one wing and it's not going anywhere. So just make sure you do a really good job. And you're going to want to put another coat of epoxy on this so that it is nice and shiny for our drip and our decals and all of that fun stuff. This did take me a while to sand, just so we're clear. Alright guys, now we're going to start our drip, the best part. This part I do use facet epoxy. Why? Because it cures so much faster, and I've been doing this method for my drips since my very first drip. So I'm doing equal parts of part A and part B, okay? I would say I probably mixed about 30 or 40 milliliters of both parts. I always like to have extra drip left over just in case, so I'd rather waste epoxy and have that extra just in case I need it. And this was not warmed up, so as you can see, it's coming out of the bottle really slow, but that's how I want it. I want my drips to be thick, and for this specific tumbler, I want this drip to have dimension. Like, I kind of want it to be globby without being globby. So you'll kind of see what I mean here in a little bit. So we're going to mix both of those parts thoroughly, and I'm going to add a little bit of pink paint in it. I only have my airbrush paint, so I'm just putting a few drops of that in there, but I will say you do not need a lot of paint. If you put too much paint in your drip, it'll be really gummy and it's going to be a pain in the butt. So I did about 2 or 3 drops, and that pigmented it pretty well. And now I'm going to add a little bit of Athena in there. This will give it a little bit of a sparkle, but it'll also help thicken up our epoxy for the drip too. So it's kind of like a win-win. Nice and sparkly. I then also added a little drop of white paint just to lighten it a little bit. Now we're going to use our CC DIY Nice and Thick. I started out with 2 teaspoons in there, and I am mixing it thoroughly. I know at first it looks like it's never going to mix together. It will. Trust me. This is how I get those thick dimensional drips. So if you want a really runny drip, you might want to skip the Nice and Thick altogether. But after I thoroughly mixed that, I added 2 more teaspoons of Nice and Thick in there. Like I said, I want it to be really, really thick because I don't like my drips to run the whole way down my tumbler. So mix, 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 and then we're going to get to the fun part here in a second. Like I know it looks thick, but trust me, if you do it right, it'll thin out on your cup, it'll smooth out on your cup, and everything will be great. Trust me. Now I'm going to angle you up so you can see me drip. So I put some on my popsicle stick and I start adding it to my rim and scraping it on my rim. I want that whole top part of my rim to be covered with this pink globby epoxy. So as you can see there, I'm scraping it right on my rim. And for the most part, this will drip down on its own, but we will also force a few drips after I get the whole rim covered first.
Excuse me, can I help you?
So do you see how thick and globby it is? I like that. It's not lumpy and it's not clumpy, but it has a lot of dimension to it, and I think it just kind of fits the Halloween vibe for this tumbler. So definitely get your whole rim first, and then you can start forcing those drips. You see how I'm kind of pushing it down right there with my popsicle stick, and over the next 20 minutes it'll slowly kind of drip down as long as it doesn't flash cure.
I could swear he had a gun.
So a big glob right there. This whole process probably took me about 10 minutes to get perfect.
So good.
There we are again, kind of forcing it over that edge.
Honey, please don't eat so fast.
No, I'm fine, really.
You could also grab a heat gun and hit it for a few seconds, and that'll kind of warm it up a little bit and let it drip even further and let it kind of smooth out that way. Not too much heat. Too much heat will flash cure your fast set, but it is okay to hit it for a few seconds with your heat gun. And right there, you just saw me kind of force another drip. And then we're also going to drip the bat wings. That part was a little harder, but I think it turned out really amazing.
Dr. Charles?
Doctor, I'm going to be right back.
I'm obsessed with this. As you can see, I am taking my time. I didn't speed this part up either, so this is all in real time. I'm going around, making sure I don't want to force any more drips. It looks like I did need a little bit more right there, so I'm kind of pushing it down with my popsicle stick.
I could report you. I should report you.
Dr. Mary, you wrote a bias confirmation.
What?
Bias confirmation.
I'm a drip perfectionist. If my drip doesn't look exactly how I want it to, I'll literally wipe it off and do it again. All right, now we're going to do the wings. So I'm putting a really thick coat on the top of my wing, and I'm just trying to kind of push it from side to side so that it'll drip down on its own. So I had to be a little more careful with this part, but I think it turned out really amazing. So forcing some drips, moving some to the left and some to the right. I wanted the whole top wing to be covered, and then it just kind of dripped down on the front of the cup and then the back of the cup.
Is it true?
And you don't want to work too slow. You do have to remember this, since we use facet epoxy, it will get very hard to work with pretty fast. But I know that I can usually get 3 cups dripped with one mix of my facet drip, so I figured I would be able to get both wings done and then my main coffin part with the same mixture.
Lucy's husband can direct donate to whomever he chooses.
So here we're doing the other side of that same wing, kind of pushing it down with our popsicle stick so that it can drip down on both sides.
Stupid thing, I know, but he's a kid. Peter deserves a chance.
All right, and then we did the same thing to the other side too. Now that our coffin drip is dry, I'm taking my Dremel and I'm cleaning up that hot mess. Since my epoxy was so globby and I'm not very neat, we really need to clean that rim and sand it down, and I think the best way to do so is with a Dremel. Now I'm going to wipe all of that off, and I'm going to take an X-Acto knife and clean up anything that kind of got stuck in the rim. And it should come off pretty easily if you let your drip dry the whole time. This drip took about 2 hours and it was rock hard. So that was really amazing. All right, we're ready for decals. Almost there, guys. This is a PNG that I made for you guys. I just imported it into Design Space, sized it as needed, about 3.5 inches from left to right. And I cut it on my Cricut with a pink Tech Wrap vinyl on premium vinyl settings. Now that it's cut, I'm going to peel all that off and weed it out. And then I'm going to use a little bit of transfer tape and apply it to my tumbler. Make sure you squeegee it down so you don't get any air bubbles. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to see this come together. So now we can peel the backing off, and I'm just placing it a little higher than the middle of my tumbler. So I'm lining it up, and then I'm going to use my squeegee to get out any bubbles and lay it flat, and then we're going to peel up the transfer tape. All right, now this is a decal sheet that I specifically designed for this coffin. I messaged Judy and I was like, please. And she was like, Alyssa, it's April. And I was like, no, please. So she printed them out for me, and she's adding them to the new releases here in a couple days. So you'll be able to buy this on Tuesday. And I'm just cutting around each decal that I want to use. They have a white backing, so they're going to show up perfectly on this tumbler. And I just started placing them all over my tumbler. I didn't have a plan. I literally just picked up a decal and decided this is where it's going to go. And I did that on my whole tumbler. See how they have that white backing? It's so great. I'm so excited. So we use the rib cage, the knife, the ghosty, the bats, and all of the little baby stars all over the whole thing. I honestly didn't know how this was going to turn out. I sent the file to Judy, and I was just hoping that it would look super amazing on my cup, and it did. A little spiderweb heart. And then you can go ahead and apply your last coat of epoxy and let it cure fully. If you guys have any questions, please ask them below. This was like one of my first 3D tumbler tutorials, so if I missed anything or confused you in any way, please ask below.